My friend Billy has this beautiful 2004 C5 Z06 with a check engine light on, and he's asked me to take a look at it. He pulled the code P0154 with the very useful built-in C5 diagnostic system, so if you're not familiar with that system, here's a link to it in your upper right-hand corner so you can check out how to use it right after this video. First thing I always do is confirm the code for myself, which I will do by connecting my favorite scan tool, the AutoFix D1 Lite. So far it's been able to accurately detect every vehicle I have connected it to, and this Z06 is no exception. Next, it's going to go through and scan every module in the car, and cars these days have multiple modules controlling pretty much everything. So a full scan is a good thing to do, as sometimes there is an issue like a bad ground as an example that can be causing multiple problems, and as with any problem that needs solving, the more clues and information you have, the better. So now let's take a look at the code that is showing up under powertrain, and here we have the same P0154 DTC that the built-in diagnostics already alerted us to. To make sure we're all on the same page, let's briefly discuss what heated oxygen sensor circuit insufficient activity bank 2 sensor 1 actually means. Here is a 3-year-old's overhead sketch of a C5 Corvette. The engine at the front has 2 banks of 4 cylinders. Bank 1 is on the driver's side and bank 2 is the passenger side group of 4 cylinders. Within each bank we have sensor 1 and sensor 2. Sensor 1 in each bank is the first oxygen sensor that is closest to the engine. And so there is a bank 1 sensor 1 and a bank 2 sensor 1. Then, as you can also see, there is a second oxygen sensor in each bank that is located after the catalytic converter. And you guessed it, it is known as sensor 2 for each bank. Sensor 1 in each bank reports information back to the engine's computer about how much oxygen remains in the exhaust stream. From that, the computer can fine-tune the fueling during the 90% of the time the engine is running at normal part throttle operation. Normal part throttle operation is also known as closed loop operation. The other 2% of the time the engine is running in what is known as open loop. This only happens in 3 different situations. First is when the engine is first started and everything is cold and warming up. Second is when you're pretty deep in the throttle or at wide open throttle and the computer is commanding a richer air to fuel ratio than the oxygen sensor is accurately able to measure. And third is when the computer has determined there is a fault with one of the oxygen sensors, like our P0154, and therefore the computer has determined the oxygen sensors are not to be trusted, so it ignores them and it also sets a check engine light. Sensor 2 in our C5 Corvettes is only used to determine whether or not the catalytic converter is doing its job or not, which is to reduce emissions. So in our situation, we have insufficient activity with bank 2 sensor 1, which is this one right here. So let's pull up a graph of its data alongside of the bank 1 sensor 1 to visually confirm what activity we actually have. Before we do that, as I mentioned a moment ago, notice we are in open loop operation because the computer knows there is the P0154 oxygen sensor issue, and therefore it has decided to operate the engine without any help from the oxygen sensors. So I do expect the working but ignored bank 1 oxygen sensor to be a little on the rich side and bank 2 to be around 450 millivolts, which is where a lot of bad sensors voltage will default to. So what might cause an oxygen sensor to essentially stop working? Typical suspects are things like contamination from something like antifreeze from a blown head gasket, or someone running leaded fuel, or thermal shock, or quite simply just old age. Another possible cause of code P0154 could be a wiring issue from, say, a pinched wire from work that had been recently done and somehow a wire gets pinched, or an oxygen sensor wire comes loose, it's laying on the hot exhaust and it burns off the insulation, and then the wire conductor actually shorts out, causing the problem. In this situation, Billy has a set of Cook's long tube headers on his C5 Z06, and it's not terribly uncommon for long tube headers to consume an oxygen sensor here or there due to the fact that the oxygen sensor itself actually runs a little bit cooler than ideal, when installed in long tube headers. So in the spirit of time and to potentially make this go quicker, Billy has already picked up a new oxygen sensor for us to install. There's a lot of opinions as to what brand oxygen sensor is the best. For what it's worth, I suggested he go with a Denso oxygen sensor, and as of mid-2024, it was $60 at AutoZone. On a side note, I can't help but notice just how awesome these Cook's long tube headers fit. There's plenty of room on all sides of the tubes on both sides of the car, and that's not always the case with all brands of long tube headers. The only downside is they are expensive headers. So we went ahead and installed the new oxygen sensor, and now the Z06 has been running and is fully warmed up. As you can see, it is running in closed loop, which is a great sign. And when I graph the voltages of both bank 1 and bank 2 sensor 1, they are both fluctuating above and below 450 millivolts as they should be. And I would say Billy's C5 Z06 is back in business. Now there's one more thing to think about before we call it a day. All 4 oxygen sensors have a heater circuit that helps them to heat up quickly to 600 degrees plus, so they become efficient and effective. Billy's 2004 C5 Z06's PCM actually has the ability to trigger diagnostic trouble codes if it senses anything wrong with the heater system. So I'm sure Billy's car is just fine, but as an extra precaution and because it's so quick and easy to do, it makes sense to check fuse number 15 in the underhood electrical center just to make sure it hasn't been burnt out. This one fuse protects all 4 oxygen sensors, and the way I like to do it is by connecting the test light to the negative terminal on the battery, turn the ignition key to the run position but don't start it, and then with the test light touch each tang on the top of the fuse to make sure it illuminates brightly for each one. And this one does, so it's A-OK. Now let's back up just a little bit. If you want to be 100% sure your oxygen sensor is bad before you replace it, which is a good idea, here are a couple of tests you can do using a common multimeter. For this demonstration, I'm going to use the C6 Corvette because the bank 1 and bank 2 sensor 1 oxygen sensors, which are the oxygen sensors that are before the catalytic converters, are much easier to get to and even easier to capture good video of. Oh, and don't worry, the C6's front oxygen sensors are also of the 4-wire design, so the tests we will be doing will be the exact same ones I would do for a C5 Corvette. First, disconnect the sensor's harness from the car's harness, then identify the 2 wires that are part of the oxygen sensor harness that are the same color. And in this case, they are both black. These are the 2 wires that go to the oxygen sensor heater. Then go ahead and set your multimeter to the 200 ohm setting, and then connect its leads to the 2 pins on the connector for the oxygen sensor harness that correspond to the black wires. My reading is 7 ohms, which is normal for the oxygen sensor heaters. I believe the spec for the oxygen sensor heater resistance is between 4 and 25 ohms. If yours is outside of this range, double check the spec to be sure for your year, but most likely your oxygen sensor heater is bad. Moving on to the sensor wires within the oxygen sensor, and by process of elimination, they're the 2 remaining wires that are not the same color. In my case, it's a blue wire and a white wire. One wire is the sensor signal to the PCM, and the other remaining wire is the sensor ground. Move the scale on the multimeter to 2 volts DC, then connect the leads to the pins in the oxygen sensor harness that correspond with the blue and the white wires. Now we'll go ahead and start the engine and let it run for several minutes. During this time, the voltage should increase from near 0 all the way up well past 450 millivolts, which in my case, I've sped this up. It absolutely does. And when we shut the engine off, the voltage should pretty quickly retreat to pretty close to or all the way to 0. And so by performing these 2 very basic tests with my standard multimeter, I'm pretty darn confident that my oxygen sensor in the C6 is good. Well guys, that's a wrap on this one. Hit that thumbs up if you learned anything, share it if you thought it was really good, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and most of all, thanks for watching.